So, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Bailey from the Royal Philatelic Society London, and I'm going to hand over to Richard Stock, the President of the Royal, to start this presentation. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody, from wherever you are. Welcome to this first in the series of 3 presentations by the Royal Philatelic Society as part of Autumn Stampex 2020. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce to you Malcolm Ray Smith, who's a fellow of the Society. He's also a member of the Postal History Society and the Society of Postal Historians. And his subject this morning will be the English Civil Wars 1642 to 1649. That is part of a much wider subject of which he is an acknowledged expert, which is the development of postal services in the United Kingdom between 1550 and 1750. So with no further ado, may I hand over to Malcolm Ray Smith to start his presentation. Malcolm, it's in your hands.
Thank you, Rich. Good. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We're going to look at the story of King 1625. So by 1642, he'd been on the throne for 17 years. But during those 17 years, he hadn't called a parliament for 11 years. And when he did call a parliament, he quite often sent them home rather early. It rights, which he was invited to subscribe to. They said that the Parliament said that that was not satisfactory, so they refused to give him money. He raised taxes of his own accord without parliamentary permission or debate. By 1640, he was desperately short of money. He needed to call Parliament again, but it was a short Parliament because, again, he couldn't agree with the comments that they made about him in 40. But this time, they had learned a trick or two and said they wouldn't discuss money until the king agreed that they could not be sent home until they consented to it. So they got on and debated all their complaints and criticisms in a long session that lasted a year to 204 specific items of criticism. It was all combined in a document called the Grand Remonstrance, which was presented to the king on the first. The outcome was the next day. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Over the Christmas, everyone had time to think about things, and the king got so cross with Parliament that he decided he had to arrest the 5 most important of his critics. Set a guard over the House of Commons that day, took 400 troops, marched to the House of Commons. They obviously heard him coming, and the 5 members who were going to be arrested made their escape by boat. The Speaker's chair and read out his list of the 5 people he wanted to arrest. Nobody volunteered, but when he addressed the Speaker said, well, he could only do what Parliament, his birds had flown, and he moved on. And we're going to move on to the next slide, please.
Yep, okay.
Next slide, please.
Yes, it's there.
During the early months of 1642, the king moved away from London, first to Windsor and then further north. At irregular intervals, there were meetings with representatives from Parliament, but there was no meeting of minds. The king's legal team went home to Brasted in Kent, wrote a letter to his son Edward, who was up in Rutland, explaining that he had come home feeling very ill. But then he said, "I fear the Commonwealth is more sick than I." Next slide, please. Good. The Earl of Warwick was in charge of the Navy, and amongst other things, he was responsible for the King's fort at Harwich. But in order to pay the soldiers to man that fort, he had he was unable to repay the loan, and he was unable to get any money from the treasury with which to pay off the debts that had been incurred. And so he writes a letter to his brother, the Earl of Holland, who company that set up to explore Paradise Island in the southern Caribbean. They corresponded secretly and had company meetings secretly. Is he to repay this Mr. Cooper? You'll note that the letter is sent with a coded address. Slide 6. The fact that the Earl had written upon in Parliament, there was a debate about the state of affairs at Harwich. And obviously this got back to the King, and a week later he's writing from his court at York to dismiss the Earl of Warwick from his command of the Navy. The King is working out who he trusts and who he doesn't. And this is an important stage of his consideration of how to play things from here on. Next slide, please. Join him at Nottingham, and by the 22nd he's made up his mind and erected his standard at Nottingham Castle, sent out another invitation to everybody who was loyal to him to support him there, and in effect he declared civil war on anyone who opposed his rule. But it seems to me that as I look at all the evidence that the King had made up his mind to quarrel with all his opponents back on the 4th of January, 1642. The first battle in the Civil War was at Edgehill in the Midlands. Prince Rupert was in charge of the cavalry, and they defeated the parliamentary cavalry very easily, but chased them so far away that the infantry slogged it out face to face with no really decisive loser or winner. But I think the King won on points because it didn't stop him in his progress towards London. The Earl of Derby, who had been in charge of the Parliament, failing to prevent the king from progressing towards London. While the troops marched on, next slide, please. While the troops marched on, the prince gave the town there a good beating up. Slide 9 shows the Battle of Brentford was a win for the king fairly easily, but comments that there is fear of a bloody war which grows much stronger everywhere. The consequence was that the people in London took panic, joined the army in great numbers, and a day or two later, when the king faced them at Turnham Green, he realized he was going to be heavily outnumbered. And the sheer number of people reinforced his, make his forces stronger. Next slide, please. In the Battle of Edgehill, which we looked at just now, the chap who had been the king's commander until the day before the battle, he led his regiment into the battle and was mortally wounded. So his son stayed behind after the battle, tending his father, and so got taken prisoner in very honourable circumstances. Castle, where he was the guest of the owner, the Lord Brooke. In the meantime, the prisoner of war has become the second Earl Lindsay, and he writes a thank you letter to his friend, the Earl of Manchester. In particular, he thanks his cousin for the fact that the exchange of prisoners had been agreed to by the Earl of. This is a portrait of the second Baron Brooke. He was the owner of Warwick Castle. He was a parliamentary leader in Warwickshire and Staffordshire, and be a successor to the Earl of Essex as Commander-in-Chief of all the parliamentary forces. But only 4 or 5 days after the letter that we looked at just now, the prisoner of war letter, this man was killed, shot by a sniper at the siege of Lichfield, gradually been improved, and muskets were refined to a point where they were gifted to skilled shooters who became the first snipers. Next slide. The day that the prisoner of war sent his letter, another letter was sent from the Committee of Both Kingdoms. This was a joint committee, including representatives from the Scots Covenanters who had taken offence at the change of religious practices which the king had tried to impose upon their kirk. And there were people from the House of Commons who represented their point of view, and to the London home of the Earl of Essex. They met at 3 p.m. each day. There were some 25 members of this committee. All the letters and orders that I have seen have had the signatures of both a Scot and an Englishman. So they obviously tried to maintain the dual approach. Next slide, please. part of the activity of the Committee of Both Kingdoms was to set up a intelligence system. The way they set this up is demonstrated by a letter that they sent to Colonel John Moore, who was the governor of Liverpool, to arrange a weekly meeting. He had to go to Manchester on Friday evenings to collect his own report, which was taken back to the committee in London. Next slide, please. Whilst the bigwigs were getting on with organising the fighting, they could. George Maxwell was in command of a parliamentary force holding a castle. But he'd made an appointment to see his friend Mr. Smythe, but on a particular day he was unable to keep his appointment because he wrote a little note to explain, "I did not wait upon you this day because the enemy was abroad and had been at Gloucester Castle." Obviously somewhere not very far from where he was based. The Earl of Essex was the general in charge of all the parliamentary forces. He writes to, concerned that there were enemy troops, as he saw them, royalist troops, active in Derby and Nottinghamshire. And so this is a campaign letter giving orders to Sir Richard, to Sir Thomas Fairfax to get against the Duke of Northumberland, who was in Derby and in Nottinghamshire. You'll notice at the bottom of the letter it says, "Haste, haste, post haste," but orders of this importance wouldn't have been sent by the post. The post was pretty well non-existent at this stage. Next slide, please. In order to support quartermasters, whose job was to obtain supplies of saddles and other things, and periodically they made reports. Here it's a report to the Earl of Manchester, who is the one pictured in the middle. He was parliamentary armies. And there are a number of letters to this chap that we shall come across in the course of the talk. Next slide, please. Sieges were an important feature of the mission. Lord Lowther, Colonel Lowther was a Pontefract, which was held under siege, and the was being held by Lord Fairfax. He offered terms for exchange of prisoners, but the Colonel felt that these were not terms that he could, the terms of the offer. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, in Norwich, which is one of the biggest cities in the country and an important supporter of the councillors, and 13 of them signed a report to the Earl of Manchester with comments upon how the war was progressing from their point of view. And the second report from them later in the year was signed by some of the same people, but one second report. But there were other sieges going on. And next slide, please. Citizen of Wakefield, and he's concerned about the siege of Sandal Castle. Sandal Castle was just outside his home of Wakefield. And he's reporting to Lord Fairfax as General of the... But he got caught napping because the troops in the castle suddenly came out one day and caught him and his besiegers asleep, as it were, at the wheel. And he was sent was undefeated. But in 1645, another siege managed to winkle them out, and they had to give in. Next slide, please. At Cambridge, the Committee of Safety met because they had discovered that there was a dispute between two officers of equal rank, and that needed to be dealt with. So they invited the Earl to come and talk to the two officers concerned. Next slide, please. Committee of both kingdoms. And whenever they sent him orders, they took great care to wrap them up very tactfully, because he was known to be a rather touchy sort of chap. Please. The Committee of both kingdoms were working on a number of fronts to ensure that the Eastern Associates to various counties, asking them to raise more troops. And this letter is a chase up to the folk in Suffolk. It politely asks them how soon can their troops attend a rendezvous, because it's obviously taken rather a long time to get. In addition to the next slide, please. In addition to the quartermasters, another type of person who was important on both sides was the storekeepers. And the storekeeper at Lynn, William Botterill, he reports on large quantities of goods that he sent to the Earl under a guard of 6 soldiers. And amongst one knows, I'd be interested to have your information. Next slide, please. 24. Both, this letter written in Bridgewater in September 1644 by Edward Wyndham. It reports enemy troop movements to Prince Rupert. There was a siege of Donnington Castle, which is just north of Newbury in Berkshire. The captain in command of the guards there was a chap called Silius Titus. And Silius Titus was ordered to hand another officer's troop. And he wasn't happy about this, so he writes to complain. And he's so upset that he leaves the honoured out of the address on the letter that he's written, and has to. You can tell that he is really quite upset at the orders he's received. Next slide, please. King Charles has arrived to take place, but he has time to write a personal note to Lord Conran, who's a friend of his, an Irish friend. But it's only 2 days before the Second Battle of Newbury. And at that battle, the king looked very likely to be defeated. But the parliamentary force took so long organising their troops to attack from absolutely the best possible position. But in the meantime, the autumn gloom came on and heavy mist descended quietly move away. And he escaped what should have been a heavy defeat. Those in charge were held in contempt by critics in Parliament, and the debates led to the formation of the new model army. Next slide, please. Another siege occurred at Naseby Castle, and Lord Mount Eagle was trapped there, and he asks for, and he requests the Lord Fairfax to give him a pass so that he can leave, because he'd only gone to take the waters. Next slide, please. And he's able to report that he has £4,000, which he's sending with Captain Silius Titus to be used to pay the soldiers. Slide 29, please. This slide shows Mercurius Orlicus. In the days of the Tudors and the early Stuarts, the powers that be kept tight control on news, and they only sent out public proclamations of the things they wanted the public to know. And there were numerous papers. The Mercurius title seemed to change the second word on each edition. My impression is that it's always give very biased reports of what's going on. Next slide, please. The really crucial battle of the Civil War was the Battle of NASEBY 5. By this stage, the new model army had been formed under the commander of Sir Thomas Fairfax, with Oliver Cromwell as the second in command. They, by this stage, they were able to mount a force of twice the size of the King's army. The Royalists had plundered their enemy's camp, but they sustained enormous casualties and lost most of them. In the meantime, the parliamentarians had captured the King's private papers, and these revealed that he'd been conducting secret negotiations with Catholics and others, and probably just as important as their military victory in this battle. Next slide, please. A day or so later, Lady Alafia Fairfax is writing from Oxford to congratulate in the battle at NASEBY. Of course, her father had been a general in the north, and the family had made an enormous contribution to the parliamentary forces being in a win. After this, the forces needed to deal with those areas of the country where there was still strong royal support. And Thomas Fairfax realized that if he were to take his larger army down to the West Country, he would have to have supply lines passing close to Sherborne Castle, which was still manned. So he writes to his father, who's moved to London, to keep Parliament informed, that he's waiting for large cannon to be brought overland from Portsmouth because the walls of the castle are 14 feet. Report, a further report from General Cromwell, because he sent them to deal with the clubmen. Our next slide describes who the clubmen were. The clubmen were really a third force that was threatening to emerge. They were the middlemen who had been let down by Keep about paying for supplies, and all over the country, the folk who were owed money were getting upset, and in particular in the southwestern counties, a number of meetings, and quite clearly General Fairfax was worried that these people could make trouble for him. So he sends his deputy to go and talk to them, but make sure that he takes a quantity of, he just comments at the end of his report. I have now received the enclosed from Lieutenant General Cromwell. I would acquaint the House with it. Next slide, please. In September 1645, there was a battle at Rowton Heath. This is just outside Chester. And Chester was the last of the ports that the king had control of, through which he could obtain supplies from the continent. The town were being besieged by the parliamentary forces, and this battle was really an attempt to relieve Chester from being under siege. But the king, he was able to go to this tower on the walls of Chester and see the defeat happening before his very eyes. Wounded. The siege was not immediately successful, but by the following February, Parliament had won that too. And our next slide shows that 1646 surrenders. And towards the end of the year, the king had surrendered to the Scots at Southwell. Slide 36, please. In the Fairfax family, the Revd Henry Fairfax was the younger brother of the Earl. This was if his older brothers had bagged other professions. He writes to complain about the behaviour of parliamentary troops in Yorkshire. His letter says that he believes the testimony of, he encloses with his letter a list of the detailed complaints, and he says that he believes these people are trustworthy witnesses. There's allegations of individual actions that they are accused of doing. Next slide, please. In the meantime, the Navy Board are dealing with a request from Governor Moore at Liverpool. He had asked that local ships might be used for the Winter Guard, but the Navy Board reply very politely to tell him that they have already, the ships have already been allocated in the House of Commons used. They have no discretion in the matter. Next slide, please. There's a Committee of Safety in Cornwall who writes to their MP. They write to complain that he's been accused, according to a Commons resolution on the 10th of November 1646, he stands likely to have his goods sequestered. Been marked up in the top right-hand corner, examined. I don't know whether that means that they examined it or whether it means that somebody else examined it before they saw it. Next slide, please. About 1645, King Charles had had various adventures, and in 1648 he managed to escape and got as far as Carisbrooke Castle, but found himself incarcerated there. Naseby had decided the military balance against the king. He'd lost other battles and then fled to Oxford, but then it was put under siege, and so the Scots took charge of him for some time, but they only used him as a bargaining chip, really, and having collected £100,000 towards their costs in the war. Further abortive negotiations ensued, but by November 1647 he was penned up in Carisbrooke Castle. At about this time, a number of troops were dealing with the invasion from Scotland by Prince Charles, who had persuaded the Scots that he was the legitimate king, and up in effect what became the Second Civil War. But it was all over rather quickly, because the Royalists were heavily defeated at the Battle of Preston. James Bellingham had reported troop movements to Philip Musgrave, who was this information too late for it to be useful. Another letter to Philip Musgrave came from Philip Kerwin. Slide 41, please. It's marked haste post haste with diligence, but then on the back of the letter there's a timed endorsement that explains how and why it had been delayed. You can see that the postmaster at one of the towns on the way had sent it on and then had it returned to him, and so he's used other means to send the letter to its addressee. But he was explaining the delay to say it wasn't my fault. Edward Hyde was in the Hague trying to rustle up troops and ammunition, victuals, writes to Prince Rupert to report that ammunition and victuals are on their way. In the meantime, King Charles, held at Carisbrooke Castle, managed to charm Captain Silius Titus to turn coat and become a royalist. But in late 1648, in December 1648, Colonel Pride's regiment managed to turn away from Parliament all those MPs who are regarded as being in any way sympathetic to the king. And so, in effect, they created a rump parliament in which only those who were anti-king were allowed to vote. The House of Commons found that the judges and the peers refused to judge the king, And so they turned themselves into a high court for this purpose. For the first 3 days of the trial, the king remained silent, but the outcome was already predetermined. Cromwell and his friends had decided that the king must die. And so on the 27th of January, the court announced its decision. He was condemned as a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy, and sentenced to be executed. And 3 days later, that sentence was carried out. So the king died. That wasn't the end of the story, because after this, there was a republic declared, and then a protectorate. And it wasn't until 1660 that monarchy was restored and Charles II came to the throne in England as well as in Scotland and elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the display. If you have questions, please send them in now, please.
Thank you, Malcolm. And as Malcolm said, now's the time for Q&A. If you'd like to use the Q&A, some people have already used that. It's the facility at the bottom of the screen. It's marked Q&A, stands for questions and answers. And basically, if you put your question in there, I will make sure that Malcolm gets to hear it and he'll provide his answer. Malcolm, here's the first question. This is from Adrian from Bromley and Beckenham Philatelic Society. He would like to know, please, about the process by which mail was carried and delivered. Was the process different for royal mail, parliamentary mail, or more ordinary mail? And by the way, he has a letter signed by King Charles I. But what was the process, please, by which mail was carried?
Before the Civil War, there were Royal Mail messengers who carried letters at regular intervals along the 6 main post roads. After the Civil War had commenced, the king tried to retain control of the posts, but failed. The posts effectively stopped running. So all the letters that we have seen today must have been taken by friends or servants, or the military ones would have been carried by dispatch riders.
Okay, right, thank you. Adrian would also like to know, how often were letters intercepted by the enemy? How was security enforced on those letters?
I think from parliamentary reports you can see that this did happen on occasions, but I have no direct evidence from the letters that I have collected about that.
Okay. Clam asks that there weren't any postmarks really, so how do you prove the date of each letter?
Only by the fact that the letters have been signed and dated on the dates that we've said. There were no postmarks, so there's no way of telling exactly how they were conveyed from one place to another.
Okay, and the final question relates to just after the Civil War, obviously when Cromwell invaded England and called himself Lord Protector. What were the powers of the Parliament during the rule? What were the powers of the Parliament during the rule of Cromwell?
I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I'm hesitant to answer that question. But the fact was that Parliament pretty much ruled the roost. They found it convenient to ask one man to act as a leader and to be, in effect, a prime minister, we hadn't invented politics to the point where we had prime ministers in those days, but in effect, as that was his role as protector.
Okay, well, thank you very much. There being no other questions at this time, I think I would like to hand back to Richard Stock for some closing remarks. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Malcolm, it's been a very great pleasure to listen to your presentation. You know that I'm already aware of some of the material that you have in your collection. You've decided to choose, I think, a very, very difficult subject in which to explore the development of the postal history, because it's not just a question of looking at postmarks on envelopes and things like that. It cannot be presented adequately, let alone in the way that you have succeeded in doing it, without knowing a great deal about the historical events which are portrayed in the letters. Every letter that you have needs investigation. It needs a lot of research, and you've produced the results of that succinctly. There are two favourites of mine in your display. One, I think, and you know what I'm going to say next. One, I know that at a meeting of the Postal History Society, probably about 15 years ago, where we were at Sherborne, you produced that letter from Sir Thomas Fairfax describing the siege of Sherborne Castle. There were many postal historians in the room, and they sat there open-mouthed at this item produced in the locality where we were holding a meeting. The other one is the Battle of Rowton Heath. If you walk along the walls at Chester, you will pass the Phoenix turret, Phoenix Tower, and it's an exceptional walk around the walls, and one can't escape thinking about the Civil War. May I, on behalf of everybody who's attended this presentation, thank you very, very sincerely for the time and the trouble that you put into the presentation and the way in which you have presented it to us today. It was absolutely first rate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.